Alrighty, welcome everyone. My name is Kian. I'm here with Linkso, and we've got another fantastic talk by the Master Gardeners. Today we have Carolyn and Cathrin, and they're both going to be doing a talk on California natives. So please do send in your questions via chat on Zoom, and we'll address them throughout the talk. I think we'll have 2 stopping points for the Q&A session. So please welcome Carolyn and Cathrin.
Hey. Thank you very much, Ken. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you could make it out today. So we are Master Gardeners, and I don't know if you've ever attended a Master Gardener presentation. If this is your first one, welcome. We're happy to have you. And if you've been to them before, welcome back. That's great. So a few words about our program. We are volunteers, and we are trained and certified by the University of California to provide UC research-based information on home horticulture and pest management. Our goal is to help home gardeners and community organizations sustainably create a healthy environment. So we are from the group that's in the San Mateo and San Francisco counties. We are a single group of Master Gardeners. Most of the counties in California have their own Master Gardener group. So that's who we are. And we do hold a lot of events, online events and in-person events. So we will certainly invite you to go to our webpage, which will have more information at the end of the talk, where you can look at a whole host of events that we hold, as well as there are opportunities to sign up for our monthly newsletter and get some gardening tips, and also get more information about the programs that we do. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself, and then I'll have Cathrin introduce herself. So I am, as I said, a Master Gardener. I've been a Master Gardener since 2020. And before that, I was a Master Composter back in 2008. So I've certainly had a lot of interest in gardening. I grew up with vegetable gardens, and I just always loved to be outside and doing gardening. I really love plants. I've been a member of California Native Plant Society for about 30 years now. And I've just always been interested in plants and hiking. So, this talk on gardening with natives is kind of falls right in place for me. It combines 2 of my loves, the great outdoors and the native plants in this area, and gardening. I'm a native, born in San Francisco, raised on the peninsula, so I've been here my whole life. And I joined the Master Gardeners after I retired in 2018. There was a class starting up the next year. So I was fortunate to get in the class, and I've joined Master Gardeners, and I've been loving it ever since. And in case you have any questions about how to become a Master Gardener, I'll catch you right now. We offer training classes about every 2 years, and we have just selected the training class that will start in 2024. So we won't be having any applications for a couple of years, but if you get on our newsletter, you'll be able to keep tabs on when the next opportunity will be to apply for the Master Gardener class. Okay, well, that's all about me. Cathrin,
okay, a little bit about me. So I'm Cathrin Callas. I'm one of the latest crop of Master Gardeners from 2022. In fact, we were the Zoom generation, so being on Zoom is kind of a natural, since most of our class was done over Zoom. Not all. It's kind of hard to practice pruning while on Zoom. But I came to gardening through just loving anything that flowers, really. I'm not that picky, but being a California native and growing up kind of on hillsides in Marin County, getting to know and love native plants was kind of a natural for me. And that interest has, only grown with the years. And after joining the Master Gardeners, I was really thrilled to find that there's a dedicated group of people who really love native plants too. So it's been great learning from all those folks, getting hands-on experience at our demonstration garden in San Carlos. And, it's been a lot of fun, and I'm really happy to be able to share some of the fun with everyone else. So that's it.
Very good, very good. Yes, Cathrin made a reference to the San Carlos demonstration garden. So she and I are the co-leaders on the demonstration garden project in San Carlos, and it's a native plant garden there at Civic Center, or where the San Carlos Library is. You can visit it any time of day. And there's plant labels, information about, it's a habitat garden, information about the critters that benefit from the garden. So you're always welcome to go there. We may make reference to the San Carlos garden, and it's that demonstration garden we're talking about. Okay, on with the show. Well, tonight's program, I guess it's PM, right? So we're going to talk about California natives. What are California natives? What do we mean when we say California natives? Why grow the native plants? We'll talk about some of the garden considerations that you need to think about if you're going to put in some native plants. Well, and which ones would be suitable for where your garden or your space is. And then the second half is going to be to actually, select about a half a dozen shrubs and a half a dozen ground covers and annuals, some real specifics to show you what they look like, how pretty they are, how versatile they are. We'll give you a little bit more information about those plants. And we're focusing on plants on the peninsula, Menlo Park, San Carlos, that's where we live. So we're basically talking about the plants that we know about, but we're also going to try to give tips and ideas. So if you're listening to this program and you live somewhere else, and you want to have a native plant garden, you can certainly use or apply the principles that we talk about to where you live, and put in a native plant garden there. Well, also then toward the end, we'll have some gardening tips and some maintenance information on native plants. And then finally, where can you actually see some native plant gardens in addition to the San Carlos garden? Other places in the Bay Area where you can see some nice gardens to get some inspiration and ideas. And then what often comes up is, well, where can I get those plants? And we'll give you some ideas and some strategies on how to get native plants. Okay, so first, as I said, I'm going to just background. What do we mean when we're talking about native plants? So, there we go. So native plants are considered to be plants that have lived here for tens of thousands of years. And we say that because they are the plants that have learned to adapt to the conditions we have here in California and coexist with all of the insects, microorganisms, animals that live amongst those plants. So basically that sort of stayed somewhat constant until the Europeans came to the continent, and with them they brought a lot of plant material. And so there's a lot of plants now that have come since the 1700s and on to California that are not native necessarily. So when we talk about California native plants, sometimes people say, well, it's all the plants that were here before the European settlers. And and the reason they say that is just because with the settlers, other plants from Europe and other places around the world ended up coming in inadvertently many a times in the food, for the animals, or it came on the ships, just all sorts of things happened. So, and a lot of those plants naturalized and do really well here. And a lot of people sometimes say, oh, that's a native plant because it just grows on its own and does its own thing, but it might not have actually evolved here with all of the insects and the animals. So it may not have been here that long. So there are about 7,000 native plants in California, and but many, as I said, many have adapted and from other parts of the world, and we'll sort of show you some of those places where other plants do really well here, but they're not actually from here. So let me do that. And let's see, excuse me, my screen's off a little bit. So California native plants. Sometimes, one other thing I just wanted to mention, sometimes people think, oh, California native plants, those are the plants that don't need a lot of water. They're the drought tolerant or low water plants. But keep in mind, we all know California is a vast state and we have lots of different habitats in our state. So because it's California native, it's not, does not necessarily mean it's a drought tolerant or low water plant. You can well imagine, a plant that grows right along a riverbank. That's probably not a low water plant. Or a plant that grows high up in the Sierra that gets a lot of snow melt. That's probably not a low water plant. So they're not all necessarily drought tolerant, but a lot of them are. And most of the ones that we're going to talk about today are going to be the low water drought tolerant plants. And finally, in the nursery trade, there are a lot of California natives, but they are hybrids or selections. So they may have a name on them like, what would be a good example? Like Eve Case for a plant. And that just means it was selected because it had a feature that was attractive, or something like the Douglas iris has hybridized with other irises. And so now there's a Pacific Coast hybrid. So it's not, it has a name attached to it. And those are normally in a single quote. So a lot of times the nursery trade really is looking for the most attractive plants they can get for the people will want to put in their gardens. And so you're going to find a lot of hybrids and selections. In most instances, those are truly native plants. It's just, they might look a little fancier and special compared to the ones that you might see if you're out on the trails. So as I said, California, let's see, there we go, is really a special place. And what makes it special is it is one of the few Mediterranean climate zones in the world. So I'm sure you've heard that we live in a Mediterranean climate, and there's only a few zones in the world. And so we are obviously here up in the Northern Hemisphere, but other ones throughout the world, you've got the Southern Hemisphere along the Chilean coastline, of course, Mediterranean area that's where that term came from, little tip of South Africa, and then Western and Southern Australia. And so these Mediterranean climates, what do they all have in common? They're all along a coastal area. And so there's a lot of traits that they're going to have in common. And we're going to find that a lot of the plants that are the low water plants, drought tolerant plants, will come from one of these Mediterranean zones. A lot of people have plants that are actually from Australian origins and also South African origins. And of course, most of our herbs that we all grow in our garden, those are from European Mediterranean zone. So some of the characteristics of the Mediterranean climate, it also is very diverse, over 75,000 species. And it has summer drought and dormancy. So that sort of is what we have, right? We don't get any rain in the summer. And then in the wintertime, a lot of the plants kind of slow down and somewhat go to sleep. They take a rest. Our winters tend to be mild. Again, we're mostly in the coastal zones there. And so they're not too severe. Irregularity of rainfall. If you're here in the Bay Area and you were here last year, then you know what we're talking about. Or last few years, we've had very low rainfall, and then sometimes we'll have a fantastic rainfall winter. So that's characteristic of the Mediterranean climates. And what you're going to find is plants that have evolved in these Mediterranean climates, they have learned to adapt to these conditions. And then soils generally are low in nutrients. And, what does low in nutrients mean? A lot of times I think people think of gardening, they think of their vegetable garden, and that's going to be beds and space where the nutrients are going to be very high. If you grow vegetables, you want to get a lot of fruit out of your vegetable garden. Your tomato plants, you expect, I want 20 pounds out of this one plant. It's going to need a lot of nutrients for that single plant in a 3 or 4 month period to produce all the tomatoes that you want to have. So if your ground soil doesn't have a lot of nutrients, you're probably, as a vegetable gardener, going to have to put a lot of nutrients into it. But the plants that we're going to be talking about in the Mediterranean climate, they're used to these very low nutrient soils that are here. They're nothing like high nitrogen soils. So keep that in mind, because as you're trying to garden with natives, you're going to want to simulate these same conditions for those plants for the most success. And for the soils, that's for the Mediterranean climate, remember they're along the coast. So the coast is going to have a lot of sand, rocky and sandy. So those go with good drainage. So good drainage normally goes hand in hand with a lot of native plants. There are exceptions. There are native plants that grow in clays and other areas, but in general, they are going to prefer to have good drainage, just like matching up with the climate. And then mostly alkaline is also the typical condition along the coast, but alkaline to neutral, that's we're talking about the pH level. But there are also native plants that grow in the forests, understory plants underneath pine trees. And just like your camellias and your rhododendrons and your azaleas, that's going to be a more acidic soil. So California is a big state, and we've got lots of different types of microhabitats within the state, but but the plants that, again, the Mediterranean climate plants are hugging the coast, so they're likely to have these conditions. And just a quick discussion of the rainfall issue that I was talking about. So this is a typical Mediterranean climate chart. So our winter months starting, November, December, we get all the rain pretty much in the winter, a little bit tapers in the springtime. But this is the area. This is that real dry summers that we're talking about. If you're from the Midwest or from the South, you get summer rains. You get a lot of rain in this. I mean, they can get as much rain in like a week in the Midwest or in the South in the summer that we get in the whole year here in the Bay Area. So gardening habits are going to be different, if you get a lot of rain in the summer, but we don't. And when we often talk about don't water your plants in the summer, and there's going to be exceptions to that, but in general, keep in mind if you're putting in the native plants from this area, they are plants that have learned to adapt, to this. They'll be okay once they're established, and they really have learned how to handle these fluctuations. Okay, so why grow native plants? Well, as let's see, is that right? Yeah, okay, sorry. So people have lots of different reasons why they grow them. For me, I really like plants. I love seeing all the diversity in nature, and I love seeing the plants. I can go out hiking and then I can try to grow that plant here at home. And it's interesting to see if critters, like in this case, we've got a picture of a swallowtail visiting a coyote mint. So I just find it very interesting. Also, I feel like native plants just, I don't know, they're a little bit more tranquil. They give me more of a sense of place and season. In most cases, even if they're bright and colorful, they're kind of a quiet impression instead of just really jumping out at you like, 6-foot dahlia or something like that. So I like the tranquility that I get by having a native plant garden. Another good reason is really you don't need pesticides and fertilizers very much. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But in general, because they're adapted to here, they don't tend to need pesticides because they've learned to adapt to the local insects that are here. And I found where if you had the more native plants you have, the diversity of species, it really seems to keep your garden in check. I mean, I think that's true really of all gardens. I have a few roses, I have some camellias. I think plants that may be more vulnerable to some diseases here because they weren't adapted to this area and they just need some special attention. And maybe my garden isn't the absolute perfect habitat for a gardenia, but a camellia, but I want to have it. So, when you put a plant in place that's really not quite the right habit, they're going to be fussier. So you might need fertilizers or pesticides, but I've just found that I have so many different plants in my garden that I don't really deal with pesticide issues at all. And fertilizers, just very select plants for a specific reason. Now, one of the big reasons why people would want to have natives is supporting the wildlife, and that provides food and shelter for the local animals. And I'll have a few slides after this, just talking briefly about why I think it's pretty important. And I was just this morning, I'm a kind of a bird watcher, very casual bird watcher, but I just love looking at the birds in the garden. And, with all that diversity, there's just a lot of bird activity going on. And I really enjoy that. And in addition to supporting the wildlife, it also attracts pollinators. And there's, I think, been a big push to encourage pollinators. It's good for them. And so native plants are one really good way to do that. So let's see what we got here. So as I said, I've got a few slides just to kind of drive it home just a little bit about why putting in native plants is so important. And you've probably heard of the insect decline and the monarch butterfly decline. So these are just charts, and we don't have to really see the specific, which insects, but these are all these different categories of insects. And just the amount of decline of their populations is just staggering. And we know about the Western monarch, it's from an all-time high reported back in the 90s it was almost in California, the West Coast population was down to just thousands. Now, last year, 2023, wasn't much a better year, but nothing near these numbers. So there's just been this gradual trend of almost all the insects, their populations have been going down. And just like the insects, right? Who eats insects? The birds. So the birds populations have been going, this is a 50-year trend. And it's just devastating what's been happening to the birds. A similar issue with songbirds and the populations going down. Many of the factors have been described as loss of habitat and food sources. So I've been inspired by an entomologist, Doug Ptolemy, who's a professor at the University of Delaware, who has spent his whole life as an entomologist studying insects. And he's written several books for the public to share what's been happening. And then maybe there's some things that we can do. And the story that really drove it home for me was talking about feeding birds. Most people want to have birds in their garden. Well, if you're going to have birds in your garden, you need to have baby birds. And if you're going to have baby birds, then you need to have food for baby birds. And baby birds have soft throats, and so they need soft food in their early lives. So they're not eating, seeds. They're not getting nectar out of flowers, which birds can do. They're being fed soft-bodied insects, so caterpillars, worms, aphids, etc. So those insects need to be, if you want to see birds in your garden, if you want to see baby, have nests and bird activity, you need to have the food there for them. And all of those insects, they need plants. So that's why these plants are just a foundation for supporting the wildlife. And I love looking at the wildlife. So don't get caught up in these details, but so Doug Ptolemy, he had actually monitored a chickadee's nest, and he figured out how many trips the chickadee made, how many eggs there were, how many caterpillars they had to support every day for their, the eggs, how many eggs are in the nest. And so it's a lot of trips, it's almost 20 days of once the chicks have hatched that have to be constantly fed. So I was just blown away by that. And so I decided, I made a little chart. In my previous life, I was an accountant, and so I still miss using Excel. So anyway, any opportunity to get, I'm going to make an Excel spreadsheet. So I made a list of all of these birds that are not highlighted. They all had nests in my yard this year, so it's a lot of diversity. And then I used data from the Cornell University Ornithology Research Department. They are the premier researchers in this country on birds. There's others, but Cornell is kind of the gold standard. And so using data from there telling me, how many eggs in a clutch, how many clutches, because a lot of times they'll have more than one nest. If it's a good year, there's a lot of food, how long the babies are in there. So I just sort of did, and then based on Doug Ptolemy's data, with the chickadee, and then I compared the size. If it's a bigger bird, I figure it's got to eat more. That's just an assumption I'm making. So I extrapolated the percentage bigger, like a Buick's wren is compared to a chickadee. Okay, if it's 10% more, then all these other numbers are going to be 10% more caterpillars and so on. Anyway, this is how many, this number here, 68,000 caterpillars would be required, or soft-bodied insects, 68,000 for all of these nests. There's eight different species of birds that I had nesting in my yard having one nest of each one of them, 68,000. And if they all had multiple clutches based on the average clutch size, 118,000 insects. I mean, it's kind of like, God, do I have that many insects in my yard? I mean, that's a little bit scary, but it just tells you how many insects are needed. Now, I am fortunate because I have a couple oak trees in my yard, mature coast live oaks, and I live next door to a property that's got a large oak tree population. So, I haven't planted enough salvias and coffee berry shrubs to probably support 118,000 soft-bodied insects. But I think with the trees I have and some of the plants I have, helped with these oak trees that are in the property next door, a large area of oak trees, that's why I was able to support so many nests. But so it just, that's why I want to have lots of plants, lots of diversity in my yard, because I want to be able to support the wildlife, starting up from the caterpillar up to the birds. So, but these are the plants in the Bay Area, 9 Bay Area counties, and Santa Cruz County. So this is just a list of plants by species. So willow is Salix, that's the genus of the plant. SP just means all there's many willow species. So if you put up all the willow species that grow in the Bay Area, there's up to 104 different species of caterpillars and soft-bodied insects that visit them. Yeah, I'm not sure why I wrote that way. Sorry about that. So willows are something that you're going to see more likely near bodies of water. I don't personally grow willows. I don't see a lot of people growing willows, but certainly oaks, the native roses, a gooseberry, and soapberry. So this is in the hierarchy of how many plants, how many caterpillars can be found on these, how many different species. And you're not going to find in this, like, let's say this is the big one I have, the live oak. I'm not going to find 70 different species on my one tree, but up to 70 species in this Bay Area region may be on my live oak tree. So I don't know how many species, maybe only 6 caterpillar species use my live oak, but I know that it's an excellent host plant. And so there are charts, and I'll show you a couple charts on some pages. I'm not going to get into the details, but there are charts out there if you're interested, which plants are going to support wildlife over others. And this is where the native plants really kind of show their strength. When you start looking at some of the non-native plants, like let's say a eucalyptus tree, yeah, they may support some wildlife here, but it might be 1, 2, 3 different species. We'll go visit a eucalyptus, but not in the kind of numbers that we see for the natives. And then, yeah. So as I said, it's not, this is Doug Tallamy, and he's the professor at the University of Delaware. And so these declines are like, it's kind of doom and gloom. And he's just wonderfully hopeful and optimistic. He's really studied the problem, and he's trying to figure out solutions. So maybe we can actually do something as individual gardeners. We don't leave it all to our national parks and national forests, but we as individuals can do something. He just looks at the whole country and he says, hey, we've got 40 million acres of grass in the whole country. That's people's gardens and municipal spaces, 62,500 square miles of grass in this country. And grass normally doesn't support much of the native wildlife. Now, I don't think he's asking for the whole country to just get rid of their grass, but we know that there's a lot of programs where they encourage people to take out some grass. So just take out a little bit, if you know, and carve out a piece of it maybe, and you can actually put native plants in, and he calls that the homegrown national park. We as homeowners can start carving out parts of our garden space that don't support wildlife, and if enough of us do that, we can start creating opportunities for the native fauna, to the native insects and critters to benefit. I think we've all heard of growing milkweed for monarchs, right? That's a native plant that the monarchs, they only can lay their eggs, so their larvae only feed on different species of milkweed. As a butterfly, when they're flying around, they can get nectar from a lot of different native plants as well as non-native plants, but they are what they call host specific as an insect. They have to have a milkweed species plant. They're not going to lay eggs. The monarch is not going to lay eggs on my dill, herb that comes from Europe, originally Mediterranean climate. It has to be, and they're not going to lay them on coffee berry, a native plant. It has to be milkweed for monarchs. So people have really embraced that chance to help wildlife for that individual insect. And there's other insects that benefit from milkweed, but I think we can do more. And getting everybody to do it, I think will, it's just a twofold benefit. It'll help the wildlife, and I think you'll find your garden is going to become a lot more interesting. They say, if you build it, they will come. I mean, wouldn't you agree, Cathrin? If you plant it, they will find it. It's almost as if you can plant something like a hummingbird likes, and by the time you turn around, the hummingbird's already there visiting it. I planted a plant for a friend and did that, and a hummingbird found it less than the same day because it was blooming. So these are a couple of the books that Professor Tallamy has written, Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope. And they're really, I think he has an East Coast bent. So if you're all a local listener here, just keep that in mind. But that's his area. That's what he knows the best. But you can apply the same principles here in California. And there's a book that just came out in 2023, a children's version of Bringing Nature Home. I haven't seen it yet, but I plan to look at it as soon as possible. But it's a book written for kids, and it's not like a toddler's book. It's written for kids that can read, and I'd probably say maybe 8 to 14 years old. But it's a book that I think a lot of kids will probably enjoy and maybe get inspired themselves. Okay, so that's my spiel on why I think it's important to put in native gardens. So what are the things now we have to do? We're interested in putting in native gardens. What are some of the things that we have to think about? Well, this is now gardening 101, right? Site analysis. No matter what you're putting in your garden, whatever plants you're interested in, you have to really look at your garden first. If you try to force something in your garden because you really like it, but you haven't done your site analysis, a lot of people run into trouble that way. I think sometimes, you'll go to a nursery and I do this all the time myself. Oh, it's so pretty. Oh, I love that plant. I just bring it home. I don't know anything about the plant. I have no idea, is it really going to be happy in my garden? But I just kind of fell in love with that plant. So it came home. And then if you figure out, like I have a pretty shady yard and it wants full sun, well, what am I going to do about that? So the best thing is do your analysis first, really get to know your garden, and then you go through the process of selecting plants. So you probably know things that's happening in your garden, but the three main things are the sun conditions, how much water moisture is in your garden, and to some extent we can control that, right? And then drainage, how is your soil, how well does it drain? Because these are all important questions, especially for the native plants. So, with regard to the sun issues, remember it will change over the seasons. Or in case of a friend of mine, a tree came down and her shady yard became a instant overnight sunny yard. Those things happen, and you can't really plan sometimes for those things to happen. But get to know your garden throughout the season. If you have trees that drop their leaves, like let's say maple trees, maybe right now that's shady, but in the winter time and early spring it may be sunny and get more light. So those are important factors. And I think with the natives, especially when you're looking at natives and selecting natives, if you select natives that have a wide range that grow in the wild, like let's say they grow from Oregon to Santa Barbara, they probably are part shade, they probably can handle a lot of different conditions. But if you find a plant that you really like and it just grows in the Mojave Desert, it could be in the shade in the Mojave Desert, but it's such a narrow area where it grows that you're really going to have to monitor what that condition is and make sure you emulate it, because you're just not going to have success with it. I tend to select plants that aren't just from one specific area, but that really grow in maybe they grow in the foothills, or they grow in part shade, sun, ones that seem to handle a lot of different conditions, because you're just going to have more success with them. Some of the plants we're going to be talking about, they grow along the coast here, which, it gets fog, it's more humidity. And then they also grow inland where it's drier and hotter, and the sun may be more intense. So when you are selecting plants and you find plants, they grow it here, it's grown here in the wild, that's probably going to be a plant that's very flexible on sun. Full shade, of course, would be plants like under the if you're in a redwood forest, it's a big redwood forest. There's redwood forest from way up north down to, let's say, Marin County. Well, it's a great range, but it's full shade everywhere in that redwood forest mostly. So, that's a situation where, you definitely keep in mind the shade. It would be important. So water, again, look again, where are these plants coming from? And if you're getting a plant that comes from a moderately high water area, then it's not probably going to be very happy getting a low amount of water. So if you really want that plant, you're going to have to figure out, how am I going to, keep it well watered. So again, if you find those plants that can take low water to low, like extremely low water to low water, that's great, because they probably can handle a little bit of drought, or they can handle a little bit too much rain. They're not so fussy because they have that nice wide range of water. And then drainage. Now, I think drainage might be the most important thing, because the sun is obvious. That's a full sun spot. That's a shady spot. The watering, you can somewhat control, but drainage, sometimes it's not so obvious to people how their soil drains. Does it drain quickly, or is it more standing? A lot of people think they have clay when they really have compacted soil. They have poor drainage, but it's not because it has clay particles in it, which are really fine particles that would hold water. It's just been compacted, maybe from construction or something like that. And so the drainage is poor there. And depending on your soil conditions, there might be things you can do to help change them a little bit. But in general, I would say these native plants that we're talking about, the drainage is pretty important. You don't want it so fast that it's like sand where the water goes straight through. What you really want is something that's kind of in between clay and sand, like a sandy loam or something like that. The main thing is know what your site is and what conditions you're starting with. Of course, the other criteria, we're talking about how do you select plants? Well, what do you want? Do you want a tree? Do you want a shrub, a vine, a perennial? Think about what you're doing design-wise, or what feature you want for that in the garden. Also, a usage. There are plants lists of ground cover, native plant ground covers. Maybe you want a hedge, something fast-growing, or you want to attract pollinators. Deer resistance is a really big one. A lot of people like native plants, but guess what? That's what deer eat. They eat native plants, right? They are browsers. They browse on the shrubs. So some native plants are just candy to the deer. We've discovered a few instances in the native plant garden, but so we have to be careful in the San Carlos garden, because even though it's pretty close to downtown, the deer have visited our garden, and so deer resistance is a real big issue if you're here in San Mateo County. And then one of my biggies is ease of care. I don't want a super fussy plant. I want something that's pretty easy. And then flower color. A lot of people have color palettes for their garden. And so there are ways, Cathrin will probably help walk us through ways that we can figure out some of these native plants that have the features that we're looking for. Okay, so as I said before, we're looking for plants compatible with our soil. I think the sandy loam is really the best, really good drainage. I already talked about clay. Amendments might be needed if your soil's been altered physically or chemically. So physically, if your soil's been like construction, compression, there might be amendments, organic material that you can put in it. But I don't recommend using manure compost if you're having native plants. And chemically, again, soils can be altered chemically. If a lot of fertilizer's been put in the soil, it may have salts in some of the fertilizers. So the native plants, they just want their simple, basic soil, that the typical conditions, so that anything that had like a lot of fertilizer or was compressed, they may need organic material added to it. And as earlier I alluded to, most native plants don't have a single preference. They have a lot of them have a wide distribution, so they can handle a lot of variance. So plant selection ideas. I'll go through this pretty quickly, but where do you get your inspiration to get plants? What inspires you? And so for me, it's looking outside, going outdoors. I love going over to the coast. This picture on the left is a picture on the coast. coastal scrub, it's often called. The picture on the right, you can tell that's on the coast, some iris and coyote brush there. So I kind of get inspiration there, and I'm like, how can I bring that home? I'd like to grow those plants. And in the middle, that's a vine, a honeysuckle vine, and that grows in oak woodland. And I have a lot of oaks in my garden, so oak woodland is another place where I look for inspiration. Yeah, and let's see. Okay. Now, I kind of, again, Doug Tellamy really inspired me with his analysis of chickadees. So I get my inspiration seeing things in nature, and then I'd like to grow them in my own garden. But it's like, okay, how about if a chickadee were deciding what to put in the chickadee's garden, what would the chickadee want? Well, the chickadee's gonna really want food. You know, this is like the vegetable garden for the chickadee. You know, he wants his food. He or she wants their food. So from a chickadee's point of view, you know, you have to think of all stages of life. You know, I'm gonna have, my babies are gonna need these nice soft-bodied insects. So I'm gonna want plants, right, these soft-bodied insects are going to be born on and hatch and eat, so I can then hunt them down so I can feed my babies. But I'm an adult bird, so I'll eat soft-bodied insects, but I can also eat moths and other things. So, you know, so chickadee's going to want a real diversity of things for it. So I just think, because I do think about the birds in my yard, you know, what would they like, and, you know, kind of taking care of them. So here's a picture. I love this picture. So this is a really beautiful gum plant. It's a plant that grows on coastal areas. Also, I think it grows in chaparral, but you see right in the middle, there's a nice, juicy caterpillar just waiting for somebody to find it. So hopefully, I don't know who to root for here, but some of the plants that really give, I call it the big bang, that really produce a lot of support a lot of these insects are going to be your oak trees. We talked about that. Manzanitas also, and ceanothus, which is the California, sometimes called California lilac, coffeeberry, toyon, coyote brush. These are all mostly evergreen trees. There are oak trees that drop their leaves, but all the rest of them have leaves year round, and they really support a lot of insect wildlife, but the plants are capable of also surviving. They're not decimated in most instances by insects. So that's what a chickadee says. Hey, I would think about all stages of my life, and I got to eat. Well, my selection process, I keep it pretty simple. I live in Menlo Park, so I want plants that can grow well in Menlo. I basically want low water plants once they're established. I don't want to pay high water bills, low maintenance, because, you know, I'm a bit of a lazy gardener, really, and sometimes I want to go away, and I don't want the plants to have to be fussed over. I like to support wildlife. I like to look outside in the garden and see things happening. I like flowers, like Cathrin said. She does too. And so I want the blooming periods to last long and late into the season, not just spring. It's easy to get plants that bloom in the springtime, but what about summertime? What about the fall? You know, I have friends that are beekeepers, and, you know, it's no problem with the bees. These are the European honeybees. They're not native, but, you know, they're going out in the gardens and they're looking for food. The queen can live 2 or 3 years, so, you know, it lives a long time. But it's easy in the spring and into the early summer. But when you start getting into August, September, October, it's getting harder and harder for them to find food sources where they can get nectar. So having a nice long bloom period, you know, is important, I know, for beekeepers. And then, of course, it's part of my selection process is I got to get plants that I can actually get, right? If, you know, oh, this is a great plant, but oh, nobody has it. So that's, you know, that's just practical. And then I also wanted to look an attractive plant. I don't want it to be, because, you know, native plants sometimes have a reputation for not being super attractive. So I want it to look really nice and be able to fit in with my garden that already has some established plants in it. So we're not going to really read the details of this, but just to let you know, there are lists here. So if you're interested in attracting pollinators and beneficial insects, you know, butterflies, caterpillars, and so on, the Xerxes Society is a nonprofit, scientific, research-based organization for the conservation of invertebrates, of insects. So they have charts with lots of different species. Like I said, we're not going to read the details here of all those different insects that are supported, all the different plants that can support all these different insects, which will help, you know, get the animals out there. Okay. So another thing I like to do, because I have nice established plants, is I don't think you have to take out your whole garden and put in native plant garden. I've got these great camellias that have been here, oh gosh, I don't even want to think about it, 70 or 80 years on the right. I love those camellias. They're beautiful. And they're kind of underneath, it's funny, they're underneath a coast live oak. So the native tree with the camellias that are from Asia. And then underneath it, it used to be Vinca minor. Well, I'm not a big fan of Vinca minor, so I took that all out. It's also called periwinkle, I think. I took it all out, and then I put some natives underneath. And so the understory of the camellias, and I have just Douglas iris and then something called ocean spray. So I think they work really well together. And then on the left is a picture of, well, you can see there's vegetable beds on the left-hand side. And I have a vegetable, this isn't my vegetable garden, it's a friend's, but I do the same thing. I have my vegetable garden, but I always want to have things blooming near the vegetable garden because it's going to bring in pollinators. And the more pollinators I have to bring in, they'll also come visit the vegetable garden. So my friend, she's got natives along the fence line on the right-hand side. So she's got native plants on the right, and then she's got her vegetable garden going on the left. So you can, you don't have, as I said, put in all natives. You can start kind of filling in where it might seem appropriate, and it'll, like I say, help the native insects. And in this case, it's going to enhance the vegetable garden, I think, having those plants there. Oopsie. And then seasonal interest. The gardens are always changing. How it looks in the spring is not going to be how it's going to look in the summer, fall, and winter. So a lot of the plants have a seasonal interest to them that can be, is attractive to some people. And so this is an example of a flowering currant. Well, it looks absolutely stunning in the springtime. It's this beautiful pendulate inflorescences, it's just gorgeous, but it can't stay like that forever. And so these currants, they will eventually drop their leaves. So they'd have a fall color. Now, we don't have fall colors in the Bay Area like they have in the Northeast, but we have our own version of going into fall and winter. So here is that same plant, the flowers are long gone. The beautiful green leaves are starting to change color in the fall, and then they will eventually drop, and you'll just have there'll be no leaves on it, and then they'll wait till early winter, and then they'll start in again with the flowers and the leaves. So it definitely makes the garden interesting, watching it evolve and change over time. So as I mentioned, one thing we can do is look at natives by flower. A lot of people, flower color, a lot of people, they want red or pink flowers, or they want white flowers, or they want purple flowers. Well, a project that we've been doing at the San Carlos Native Plant Habitat Garden is collecting data every couple of weeks on what is blooming throughout our garden space. Now, there are charts showing native plants and when they bloom, but ours is very super local. We just wanted to see what's blooming when, and just delighted to see Cathrin. Thank you. You put this together. It's awesome. And she does most of our data gathering. And, some of these plants you're going to see have a really short bloom period. So each one of these columns is a month. So it only bloomed like 3 months, and it probably really bloomed nice in the middle and a little bit at the beginning and maybe a little bit at the end. But then the rest of the year, 9 months of the year, there's nothing. But then look at this top line. This top line is yarrow, 12 months of the year. That's fantastic. Now, it doesn't mean it bloomed profusely every single month, all of the time, but it means in our garden, and the garden's only been there 4 years. So, things can change, but we've had it blooming. We've been able to see it blooming over 3 years of data in every single month of the year. And these early months like January here and then December here, there's obviously not a lot blooming. If we want more things blooming, well, we're not going to get these plants here, whatever they are. I don't have to read them, but they're not going to bloom for us in the wintertime. But maybe I want more color. Well, maybe I should put a few more of these plants in. So it's kind of a good way to plan if you want to really have that color fill in. To do some analysis. We have this chart for San Carlos. I think it could be very well adapted, these plants, if you're on the peninsula. but I like it because it's very, very specific. A lot of charts will have, well, it blooms in the spring or it blooms in the summer. The tool, Cathrin, I think you're going to show alludes to some plants, but maybe it's in the whole state when they bloom. But this is very specific. Let's see here. And so so just showing another version of it. So these are the white flowering plants, when they bloom again. So anyway, I think it's pretty cool to see this. And as we do look for having more color in these early winter months, this might be something that we go to and say, well, let's just get some more of this or that. And then we also have it in the blues and purples. I don't have that with me. Okay. So let's see. So plant selection and other considerations. I kind of went through what would a chickadee consider? What am I considering? And then just some of the other ones. Like I mentioned already, ease of care. I think that's really important. If you're really new to native plant gardening, I highly recommend don't get anything too fussy. Just easy to grow plants. And there's a lot of easy to grow native plants. I'm sort of a plant curious person. I just like plants. So there's somebody here kind of admiring a soap plant here. This is white blooming, little white blooms. It's in the lily family. It blooms in May, and it blooms in the afternoon. So about 4:30, between 4 and 5 o'clock, the blooms start opening, and they only bloom one day each. And you have a nice long stalk, and maybe 1 or 2 on that stalk at the base will bloom. So they'll open between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock. They'll bloom for the night. Maybe if you get up early, you'll still see it open, but then they close. And that the next day, the next plant flower on that stalk will open, but the other 1 or 2 won't. So it only blooms once. Each flower only blooms once. And well, anyway, I'm a plant curious person, as you can tell. I just love this plant. So we actually have it right outside, so we can't miss it when it's blooming. So availability, as I mentioned, that's going to be real important. And Cathrin will share how you can find where these plants are available. And keep in mind that if you can't find a plant, ask a local nursery, ask them if they can order it. It's a possibility. Okay. So Cathrin, I think you're on determining plants suitable for garden.
Okay, I'll have to tell you next slide. So, okay, we're going to start off before we get into other details, a little bit about plant names. And most people know that there are common names for plants like daisy. Well, if you look around, there are lots of daisies. And if you want a specific daisy, then you really have to be looking at the botanical or scientific name, because those are unique for any given plant. And there's an example here, a coast redwood. There are lots of redwoods. If you just say, I want a redwood, you could get a lot of different things. But if you say a Sequoia sempervirens, then everyone knows exactly what you're talking about. So it's really good if you're looking for a specific plant when you're shopping or when you're researching, use the scientific name, because then you're sure to get the one that you're looking for. Now, really quickly wanted to mention now, a lot of people, myself included, struggle with pronouncing some of these things. And I think the good news is that even the experts don't agree on how to pronounce these things. So don't worry about it too much. Just kind of blurt it out or write it down and bring it on a piece of paper or on your phone and show it to the person at the nursery, and they'll know what you're talking about. I mean, how easy is it to say Nemophila menziesii versus baby blue eyes? Personally, I like baby blue eyes, but if you want to make sure that it's the right Nemophila, then you have to use the actual species name. But again, don't worry about, blundering on pronouncing. Everybody does it, and you'll get through it. But write it down. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is Calscape, which will help you find those scientific names. So Calscape is a web app that is operated by the California Native Plant Society, and it's aimed at gardeners. So there are a lot of online research databases, USDA, conservation databases, the Jepson Manual, which is the authoritative resource on California natives. But Calscape is aimed at gardeners. So it has a lot of information there to help you find plants for your garden and then learn about the plant before you ever actually even see it in person. And the first thing, the little orange arrow there, is pointing at, you can put in your address, your actual street address, your zip code. You could type in San Mateo County, and it will bring up plants that are native to that area. So that's a good place to start, especially if you're thinking about the local critters and wanting to support them. Best place to start is with plants that are native to your local area. So, but of course you can look all over California too. It's wide open. So yeah, the next slide is, let's see. When you go into Calscape, you'll notice on the left-hand side, there are all these little tiles, and they show groupings of plants. And those groupings they're partly based on like the plant families, but also they're based on what the volunteers at CNPS have categorized things to try to give you useful groups. But there's also the all plants little symbol there. So that will show you everything. Now, that can be a lot of plants, right? 400, 500 plants. And that's probably more than you want to go combing through individually. So in the upper right-hand corner is the advanced search button. And don't be afraid of the word advanced. It's actually just a filter search. You go to the next slide. If you've ever shopped for clothes on a website and you're looking for a short sleeve shirt with a collar and in blue, then you can handle Calscape filters because it's the same kind of thing. This is just some of the filters. There are more, but you can say, well, what kind of plant? You know, I want a tree or a shrub. Just for a hint, perennial herb and annual herb. Annuals are what we think of as, well, those are just the plants that live and grow and die in one season, and perennials last multiple seasons, but they're typically not woody. Anything that's kind of super woody and grows sort of larger is a shrub. But these classifications actually can be a little bit, they can overlap a little bit. And the sun, what kind of sun you're looking for, drainage, water. Again, the common uses are things that volunteers have classified things in. So you can click one or more, all of these, and then get some search results. And you're going to get a lot fewer than 500 plants to look at. So that can really help. You can also, for instance, Carolyn mentioned, you can say, well, what season does it bloom? Now it's by season. So there's 4 choices, right? But also what color. Now, a little tip on the color, we don't have it on here, but you know, when people are entering plants and you're looking at the plant, say, well, what color is it? Well, native irises, Douglas iris, they can be anywhere from white to blue to lavender to purple to, so there are a few that are yellow, right? And in Calscape, you'll see all those colors listed. But if you're looking for a blue, my hint to you is also click purple and maybe lavender, because, you know, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. How blue is it and how purple is it? So I tend to want to, you know, like pick the range. Same thing with white or cream, right? Whether it was entered as white or cream, it's kind of a judgment call. So I would click both, and then it'll show me all of those and I can decide. So if you go to the next slide. So once you have picked some, you'll see thumbnail photos, which gives you a better idea about what plants matched your search. And usually you'll see like the flower is the featured core thing, because that's what a lot of people are looking for when you're designing a landscape. You're really interested in the showy bits, right? And for a lot of us, for me in particular, I really love the flowers. So this gives you this first, you know, okay, now there's only 13 plants based on this particular search. And if you click on one of those, you get a lot more information. So this actually is a great example of botanical name versus common name. California aster. There are so many asters that are native to California. They're called different things. But that hard to pronounce Latin name or botanical name, I say Corythrogyne phylogenifolia. I don't say it very easily, but I've had to practice. That is this particular aster. So if don't go to a nursery and say, hey, show me an aster, and you could get a lot of different things. But this is really dense. We're not going to go over the detail, but just to show you that you get a lot of information. It is primarily aimed at gardeners, so people who are looking to grow this plant at home. The map on the right is worth noting, though. That shows the native range of the plant. So the yellow kind of shows approximately where you would expect to see it in the wild. And if you have a plant, as Carolyn was talking about, some plants like yarrow, the whole thing is almost the whole state is yellow because it's like grows just about anywhere in just about any conditions. Now this plant is a little bit pickier, but you see it actually grows in a lot of different parts of California. So it's very adaptable and very tough. But as you can look down, there's a bunch of different icons and you can see how big it gets and how much water it needs. And at the bottom, you see these little symbols, which are similar to the Xerces table symbols. Does it do something particularly for birds, butterflies, caterpillars, and bees? And then that bottom row is, well, what butterflies and moths does it host? That means that the butterfly or moth will lay eggs on it, and those larvae will eat the leaves. And that's a good thing. If it's in your vegetable garden, that's not a good thing. But for a native garden, we like that because that feeds the birds and it perpetuates the butterflies and moths. Usually, you won't have them to the point where it will really bother the plant. Now, there will be exceptions, but normally it's not in nature's best interest to devastate the plant because then the caterpillars would die. So usually these things are welcome. And if you're looking for something with good habitat value, wildlife value, the more butterflies and moths on that list, the better. Mm-hmm. And then the next slide, that's usually you have to scroll down a page or two in order to see everything. There's even more detail. Talks about soil and drainage, common uses, sunset zones. If you remember Sunset magazine and the Sunset Western Garden book, hasn't been updated for a while, but it's still referenced because it has a lot of good microclimate information, really, really local to you. And so that can be helpful if you want to know if it's well adapted to your area. So I think that's about. So go to calscape.org. Don't be shy. It's free. It's available. You don't have to sign in order to use it at all. But I would say, I'm going to mention one thing off the slide here, that there are some features that are available if you do register, and it's free. You can have plant lists. So you did some searches. You can add plants from those searches onto a private list. And then say you're planting a garden or part of your garden. It's a way to build up your custom list. You don't have to write it on a piece of paper or something like that. You can actually make your own plant list in Calscape and look at things. So I love that feature. And you can even share the link with your friends and family. Or your landscape designer, if you have one. Okay, so another thing, again, Calscape is really aimed at gardeners. So they have this cool tool, a very simple tool to kind of get you started. Is the garden planner, and you answer 4 questions, which are not tough questions, and then it will provide you with a customized plant list as a place to get started. So, the where are you? That is the most important thing. And then what kind of style are you looking for? And then the sun, again, we've talked about how important that is. And then 4th, what are some of your priorities? And pollinator habitat, bird watching, deer resistant. As Carolyn mentioned, there's no such thing as deer proof. There are plants that are less preferred by deer. And so if you just answer those 4 questions, and then you'll get what you see on the next slide, a list of, this is much winnowed down list of plants that meet those criteria. And this list is really nice because it has a picture of the plant and then a few key bits of information. One of the key ones, especially for those of us with small gardens, is how big does it get? Because, wow, you know, I might want a coffee berry, but if it's going to be as big as my front yard, maybe because I have a tiny front yard, maybe I can't have it. So this helps you do that. Now, as an aside on coffee berry, I think Carolyn had mentioned earlier that there are the species, and then there are selections, things that maybe have mutated in the wild and somebody discovered it, or even actually in somebody's backyard in some cases. And like, hey, this is a coffee berry, but it's growing really, it's small and it's staying small. Well, that's the Eve case coffee berry, and it's much smaller than the regular species. You can buy it. It's pretty widely available in nurseries. So if you don't have a big yard, you can still fit in some of these things. But this plant list is a great way to get started again. You know, you don't have to deal with all the 8,000 plants in California. You can narrow it down and find something you'll love and that suits your site. So then they have this little thing now, you know, whether this matches your garden at all or not, you know, maybe not, but it just gives you some ideas for, given the style that you were looking for, how to lay out a garden with some of these plants. So it may inspire you and give you some ideas to get going with. It's not at all something you could just like go out and do necessarily, but the idea is to kind of get your creative juices flowing. So, and that's all I'm going to say about Calscape, except just calscape.org. Go there and have fun. It's a great tool. I'm going to now talk about we're going to talk about individual plants and what's great about some of them. So these are some shrubs
Hey,
that
Cathrin.
are easy to grow. Yep.
Cathrin, I just thinking, should we check in with
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, we talked about doing a little stop on questions.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Are you there, Kim?
Alrighty. So we do have quite a bit of questions. So let me,
I think we can probably handle maybe like 2, 3, something like that. And then we'll finish the presentation and then we'll see whatever room we have left at the end for the rest of them.
sure, absolutely. So let me start from the beginning then. Could you mention what California natives you could start from seeds now, essentially broadcasting or in flats?
Okay, I think we'll hopefully we won't run out of time. We have annual natives we're going to talk about at the end, so maybe we can catch that at the end. Yeah.
Okay. This person, they have 4 redwood trees in their backyard, and they're wondering if they are also host plants for caterpillars and other insects.
You know, I don't know off the top of my head, but that's where the Calscape tool, we, you know, have to that's where you can type in an individual.
Search for redwood. You'll see it will show you the different species of redwood, and pick the one you've got, and it will tell you right there.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah, but I imagine there's something. It's, yeah.
Alrighty. So this person heard something about not planting milkweed unless you're in Southern California, since the Bay Area is too far north for the monarchs to lay their eggs. Is that correct?
Okay, so yeah, milkweed. Yeah, that's kind of a controversial subject in our area. And so what the listener is talking about is how the monarchs migrate and they overwinter in the warmer climates along the Southern California coast, and we know that they also go into Mexico, and so the western population is in southern half of the state and into Mexico. And so the concern is, if you are growing milkweed further north, will the monarchs be laying eggs on the milkweed to hatch, and then the larvae, you know, are feeding on the milkweed up here? And I think the general thought is it's not typical for milkweed to be it dies down. It's not typical for it to be green and lush in the wintertime. So if you have milkweed, you know, what I recommend is, it's a perennial, so you just cut it at the base. So don't let it don't let it overwinter with green leaves that would invite a monarch to lay the eggs on it. There's also some pathogens that can be in that milkweed over winter that could cause diseases. So I think you can support monarchs by having milkweed, but you don't want it to have any green growth. I mean, I would cut it down by now. I just cut it. And Cathrin, yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that, in our demonstration garden, we have some narrow leaf milkweed growing, and it is native to this area. So I hadn't heard the thing about only planting in Southern California, because it's native all up and down the state, different kinds of milkweed. But it's native to this area. But in our demonstration garden, it is dried up and it's done for the year. Now it gets very little to no water, and so it's not going to stay growing when it shouldn't, right? It will dry up and die down when it should. It'll come back when it's programmed to do that. And the monarchs, of course, co-evolved with that behavior. So if we're trying to keep the monarch cycles in sync, you need to have the vegetation in sync. And if you're planting different kinds of milkweed, like tropical milkweed that stays green all year, the monarch's behavior, there's concern that it could cause them to behave the wrong way and, deposit eggs on milkweed that, the rest of the cycle doesn't support that. They get out of sync, the migration is disrupted, and so on. So, and the diseases, a lot of some of the milkweed that overwinters is supposed to harbor more of a fungus that can affect the caterpillars. So they might lay eggs, the caterpillars might hatch, but the resulting butterflies might not make it. So those eggs would be wasted. Now, the Xerces Society has a lot to say about monarchs and where to plant and when to plant and what to plant. And they're a great resource. So I suggest going there.
Good point. I think maybe one more question and then we'll continue on with the slides.
Okay, you may not cover this, but I'll ask it anyway. In addition to native gardens, this person's interested in establishing an urban forest on their land. Where can they look for help? They are in Portola Valley.
Well, let's see, the Doug telling me, the homegrown garden, that might be, it's a specific website, I think it's called
Homegrown National Park.
Homegrown National Park. Thank you. Yeah, that would maybe have resources. The California Native Plant Society has local chapters, but you might go to the state offices of the California Native Plant Society, and that is in Sacramento. So you could check their website. Further questions about that, you can also submit the question to us on our helpline. Master Gardeners, we have a helpline, and we will have information at the end. And we can research that question. Off the top of my head, those are the two that come to mind, but there probably are some others as well. Okay, so that'll be it for now, and then hopefully we'll be able to answer more questions at the end. So Cathrin, you're gonna cover the shrubs, I understand.
Shrubs.
All right.
Easy to grow shrubs. So, since Carolyn lives in Menlo Park, we're talking about Menlo Park, which actually is significantly warmer than San Carlos. It's pretty interesting. I don't think of us as that far apart, but it is. So it does make a difference. So again, this is just the criteria in this particular case. You may have different criteria, but I also subscribe mostly low water, low maintenance. I'm busy, and if I have to fuss with it too much, it's not going to do well because it's going to want more attention than I'm willing to give it. I love flowers, and I also love supporting pollinators and insects. So things that bloom throughout the year, and you won't have one plant that blooms all year as a full bloom, but given some of the resources, Calscape, my little chart, I'm going to get it on our website soon. You can pick plants, so there will always be something blooming in your garden. And supporting wildlife, you have to be able to find it. And some plants are very rare, but Calscape also, we didn't talk about that, has links to nurseries and shows you how many nurseries carry a particular plant. So you can, I use that, if nothing else, as kind of a gauge about how, if I see double digits, 29 nurseries carry this plant, it's going to be relatively easy to get. And of course, attractive, right? I'm actually looking at installing native plants in my front yard after removing my lawn, and I want things that are going to look nice year round. They don't have to stay the same year round. Deciduous might be all right for some cases, but most of the cases I want evergreen that stay attractive, don't require me to prune them all the time and things like that. Otherwise, they won't stay attractive. So here are some examples. So pink flowered currant. This is just, as I think Carolyn used the term, stunning. In the spring when it's blooming, it is just covered with these amazing pink flowers in these clusters that hang down. And that is a partial shade plant, though. You plant that in full sun around here and it will not be happy. Sticky monkey flowers, there are sticky monkey flowers that bloom throughout a very long season of time, and lots of different colors even. The native you see on the hillside is this kind of soft orange color, but the nursery selections, because it's such a popular plant and it does so well in the garden, there are plants in lots of different colors, from white to orange to purple to red to you name it. Well, maybe not purple, but kind of a burgundy. So you can find sticky monkey flowers very easily also at nurseries. And sages, when people walk through our demonstration garden, a lot of time they say, why does it smell so good here? Not something I expected, but it does. And a lot of it is the sages, especially the Cleveland sages that we have. And those are pretty big plants, but the foliage and the stems, even without it blooming, it just smells wonderful. And it has amazing flowers. Ceanothus, one of my favorites, because I love anything blue. And the amazing blue flowers, mostly blue, but there are some white, even some sort of pinkish ones, I think. But mostly you'll see blue, anywhere from like deep, there's one called blue jeans, like deep denim blue, to powder blue, sky blue, you name it. Those are in the spring, but if you have the room to plant more than one kind, you can have a succession again. Some bloom early, some bloom late, and so you can kind of eke out more blue in your garden if you have room to plant multiples. Coffeeberry, I never really knew much about coffeeberry before I started volunteering at the San Carlos garden. And I was like, well, it's a good background, Scott, but why would you ever plant Pittosporum? Because coffeeberry, it just looks neat and tidy, dark green leaves, nicely shaped shrub. Cool, but what's so great about that? And then one day I walked by and it was like the whole thing was humming. It was like it was, I don't know, vibrating, because the flowers are tiny, but it was covered with flowers and it was covered with pollinators. I saw honeybees, native bees, butterflies, you name it. It was just amazing. And manzanitas are wonderful, especially because they bloom in the wintertime. So if you want beautiful white to pink flowers on, again, a beautiful plant, which is beautiful even when it's not in bloom, manzanitas are your best bet. And in addition to being tall plants, there are ground covers. Actually, you see those a lot in just in the regular nursery section, not even with the natives. And around town, you'll see a lot of low water plantings that have maybe, kangaroo paw and Australian things and South African things. And then they have manzanita as a ground cover because they're these really low growing. They stay neat all the time. They always look good. And they need almost no water, maybe no water. And then toyon is a great plant if you want some seasonal changes and interest. It's got big white fluffy flower clusters, and then it makes berries. The berries go from kind of green to orange in the habitat garden now, we have a few that are turning red, and they look beautiful, and then they disappear because the birds love them. And so if you want to support birds, toyon are great, but if you want to keep some of those berries, you need to clip a few and bring them inside before the birds get them all. Okay, next one. So ceanothus, I talked about this again. Ceanothus also, it is so variable, and people call it California lilac, but most people actually just say ceanothus, though it can be a little bit of a tongue twister. Everything from really low growing ground cover to large shrubs or even trees. And the flowers are amazing. Sun to part shade, birds, bees, butterflies. You just don't, yeah, there's every different kind of shrub that you could think of. You could have a whole garden of ceanothus and not get bored. They do grow relatively quickly compared to some other shrubs. Again, you know, as I think we've touched on, making sure you're picking your plants carefully. It's really important with ceanothus in particular because they can be so variable. Make sure that you're getting one that's going to fit the space that it's going to go into. Don't get one that's going to be 15 feet tall and think you're going to prune it into submission, because you're just going to have a lot of work to do, because it will continue to try to grow. They're very, very tough and easy to grow, but make sure if you have a small space, pick a small one. And there are a few key things about ceanothus. One is, if you want those beautiful flowers, don't prune them in the winter, and because the flower buds have already formed for the coming spring. You want to prune them soon after they finish flowering, and ideally, especially if you're making any large cuts in pruning, when it's warm and dry, because large cuts can be susceptible to fungus disease. And the only other thing, I don't know if we're going to talk about this, but a lot of California native plants are adapted to dry summers. But a lot of them will be very happy if you put them in a place that gets summer irrigation. In fact, they will burgeon way beyond what they would do in the wild. And that's great if you're working native plants in between other plants. Maybe you've got existing irrigation in place, but you say, I really want to try a monkey flower in that spot. Monkey flower will probably just say, thank you very much. I got way more water than I expected. Some varieties of ceanothus, though, are very, very susceptible to certain kinds of fungus that grow in warm, damp soil. So if you're irrigating in the summer, those fungi will be more prevalent, and the ceanothus might just die a very fast death. There are, if you look in Calscape, and again, going back to Calscape, there are ceanothus that are tolerant of what's called regular water. I think, your typical hydrangeas and roses and bedding plants and so on. There are some that tolerate that. And so, you can look in Calscape and look for those. If that's your situation, you can't change the watering situation, but you really want to ceanothus, check out Calscape and find those. All right, coffeeberry. I already mentioned there are small varieties and then there are big varieties. And it says 6 feet high to 5 feet wide, but the one in the California, in the demonstration garden is, it's a lot more than 6 feet high. It's, I'm thinking 8 or more. And the flowers are tiny, the flowers are not showy, but it does have cool berries, which are not for people to eat, but birds and other wildlife really like them. You might still see it under the genus Rhamnus instead of Frangula, but the current botanical name is Frangula. This actually, though, I don't know that there are a lot of other, unlike asters, if you say coffee berries, you're likely to get, what you're looking for. Okay, and sages, these are really the stars. As I said, you know, the Cleveland sage, it's fragrant in and out of bloom. It blooms for a super long time, gorgeous flowers. And sages come in a lot of different colors. The Cleveland sage is, some people call it blue, some call it purple, some call it lavender. That's again in Calscape. You just check all three of those boxes and then you'll be able to see all the possibilities. But and some of these are very petite, some are very large. Like we don't have a picture of it here, but white sage, which is very popular these days. I was surprised that the variety that's in our demonstration garden is the compact variety. Well, it puts up flower spikes that are 8 feet tall and it wants to grow about 6 feet wide. So that's the small one. So if you're ever looking for white sage and you have a small yard, you want to be sure to get the compact one and not the plain white sage. One thing about, oh, you have more on that. Okay, I forgot there was more. So there's a lot of different sages. And one thing I wanted to mention about deadheading these, there are a lot, for the Cleveland sage puts out these flower spikes. They're kind of little balls where the flowers come out, and those hold the seeds. And in fact, when they're dry, you can kind of shake it and you can hear the seeds rattling. Well, I've watched goldfinches cling to those stems and pick the seeds out. So if you want to support the goldfinches or other birds that behave like that, you're going to want to leave those flowers on even after the petals have fallen. Our rule of thumb is a couple of weeks, ideally, if you can leave them on for a couple of weeks. And even then, once you clip them off, you can kind of toss them like behind on the ground. They won't show up in the garden, but foraging birds that are ground feeders will come down and other animals would come and take advantage of those. So next up is toyon, one of my new favorite plants. I actually haven't grown this in my own yard, but I've got a couple plants waiting to put in. And it's another, it kind of like coffee berry, but it's showier in terms of, it's a great, what used to be called a foundation plant, right? It's great as a background plant, but then it also comes to the foreground. It's got these bright red berries or beautiful white flower clusters. And it wants to be a pretty big plant. And also another thing to note, it is a rose relative. So there are actually a lot of native plants that are in the rose family, but they don't look like roses to most people. But because they're in the rose family, it is susceptible to some of the same things that roses are, though I've never seen like rust or black spot on it, but there's something called fire blight that you should watch out for. But that doesn't come up very often, and it's easy to prune off, and hopefully that will be done. But it's just such a wonderful shrub. If you have a neat, more formal landscape and you want to replace some, of your background shrubs, the coffee berry and the toyon are great candidates for that. Now, the silk tassel, Garrya elliptica, this is a little bit more of a unique shrub. There's the flowers that it has on it are in these long tassels. And so it's kind of an intriguing shrub. It's very handsome. It's got beautiful leaves. It grows very, very slowly. It can grow to a big size, but it could be, your sons or grandchildren, grandsons or daughters who actually see it get that big. So it grows slowly. So you're not going to have to be out there pruning it a lot. It blooms early, and it's very attractive to a lot of wildlife, and it has these really intriguing tassel kind of effects on it. So it's not your ordinary run-of-the-mill shrub, but it can be a showstopper, especially when it's in bloom. Okay, with that, I'll let Carolyn talk some more.
Thank you. Boy, I have some good ideas for my garden, right? So I'm going to cover ground covers and low growing shrubs, which are also sometimes thought of as ground covers. I think it's just so important. We would talk about protecting the soil, and one way that you can do it is with mulch, but another way you can do it is with plants. And more plants, more diversity. It's just fantastic for the garden. So here's a list of some, again, we put in the criteria for Menlo Park, some of the with low water and some of the characteristics that I'd want for my garden: ease of care, bloom seasons that are going to be pretty long. And so these are some of the sun-loving plants and some partial shade plants. We'll feature about half a dozen of these on the next few slides. I have bunch grasses here, and we're not talking about, we're not talking about grasses in today's talk. There's a few categories of plants that we just, they could be a talk in themselves, but the California native bunch grasses is something we're not talking about, but it's definitely something that you should think about when you're putting in your California natives. In our demonstration garden, we have a whole area that's got bunch grasses, as well as a partial shade area mixed in bunch grasses with other shrubs and small plants. So bunch grasses are just fantastic. And these particular species are listed for the sun, but there are also partial shade grasses. So just, this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. So here's just a list of some that came up with the criteria that we looked at. I'm not going to cover them all, but I'll just show you the ones that are kind of big highlight ones that I think a lot of people would have interest in. And buckwheats, that's definitely one that is kind of near and dear to my heart. There's actually 125 species in California of buckwheat. So that's where, as Cathrin says, this Eriogonum is the genus, but spa, it means species. Which species do you want? Do you want this little white one with the fasciculatum, or do you want these pretty red ones in the top right, the Grande var rubescens? So that's where, if you just go in and say, hey, I'd like to have a buckwheat plant, you might want to hone in and get a little bit more specific. They come in multiple colors. What I really like is they have these dense flower clusters. So a lot of these plants that benefit wildlife and insects have dense clusters. And when you think about it, having all those flowers in one place, like in a sunflower or a buckwheat or the coffee berry, if all the flowers are clustered together, a small insect can land in that cluster and then just go from flower to flower to flower to flower. There could be 40 flower heads or 100 flower heads on each flower stalk. And instead of going from one, like you think of a poppy, one flower, and then you got to fly over to the next poppy and the next. That takes a lot of energy, right? So insects, the pollinators, they really enjoy these nice dense flower heads. Sometimes they're inconspicuous and not very showy, but that's not the case with buckwheats. They're pretty showy. And we have a nice long bloom period, depending on your species, March to October. So you can have different species in your garden to get that bloom throughout the year. And another one that's a real favorite, and you probably been seeing it blooming right now, is the California fuchsia. And look at the bloom cycle, the bloom period, July to October. So these are those fantastic plants that start in the summertime and bloom into the fall. And this beautiful red color, sometimes they come in white or a pale, like a pale red, almost a pink, salmon colored. So there's different ones. The tubular flowers obviously attract, and they're red. We know the hummingbirds are going to find those before you even know it. Got a couple pictures here of some more kind of standing back. So they don't tend to get too tall. They're about, I don't know, knee high, maybe a little higher. You get some that are fairly compact. There's this Everett's Choice, which it stays nice and compact. I think, let's see, Everett's Choice. I think this is the Everett's Choice, I think. But there's some that stay nice and compact, close to the ground, and others kind of shoot up about knee high. They do get they can spread pretty easily, reseed and spread, and they can look a little weedy. But you can I just recommend cutting them down after they finish blooming. Cut them down into the winter, and then it's often recommended in this early spring they start growing. Cut them back again, and then let them finish growing and then bloom out into the summer. I often see the old name, the genus was Zauschneria. Now it's Epilobium. So sometimes if you're looking like, how do I take care of it in a book, it might not be under California fuchsia. You might have to look under the Zauschneria. I still see that name a lot. But it's a real nice, it's so nice to have things blooming, this time of year. Another one that we have in the garden is coyote mint. It's in the mint family. And this one, it's just, we can almost always take pictures of swallowtails or bumblebees on it. Again, it's a compact flower. There's so many, there's so many flowers in here that a bumblebee or butterfly is on the flower for, 45 seconds, you can get your phone out and you can take a picture because it's not going anywhere because it's just feeding off of each individual flower. And it also has can have a long bloom period. I
It's still
believe
blooming.
it's still blooming. I think
Still
deadheading
blooming
is the
like
second.
crazy. Yeah.
So we can deadhead it. And if it's the seeds are in there, like Cathrin said, just sprinkle them, around, or just kind of tuck the seed heads, the dead seed heads in the garden. They'll decompose, but if there's any viable or good seeds in there, the critters will find them and you'll get another bloom. Iris, we've talked about it a little bit. The Douglas iris has lots of hybrids, a Pacific Coast hybrid. So you can get straight species that would be out in the wild, or there's actually I think a West Coast Iris Society. People love irises, and I think every few years new hybrids are developed. There's, I think, hundreds of hybrids. So you can get lots of different colors. They bloom May to July. They're an understory plant, partial shade. Really, I call zero maintenance. If you don't like the dead flower stalks or the seed heads, you can cut those off. But otherwise, there's really nothing you need to do. This is some of the variety. These are some of the hybrid varieties. And here's a yellow one. So there's a lot you can do with it. It doesn't really look weedy or anything. They only are about knee high. So just another one to add to your garden. And then we talked about yarrow a little bit. It grows all over the state, all over the world. So it's going to be a very easy plant to grow. And it's pretty small. It's a real ground cover plant, and the lacy leaves almost look like ferns, very fern-like. But then the flower stalk comes up, and there's white flowers, or maybe a pink variety. So it's not a fern because ferns never have flowers. And it's just a nice little plant along the edges, just to kind of fill in. It does prefer full sun because it is in the sunflower family after all. But it's just those beautiful, that it's just compact head with all those different flowers right there, so that the critters can find it. You can cut it back to the base and it will come back. These are perennials. So it's a real handy plant to have. Save seed and try to grow it again from seed. Here's the pink variety, Island Pink. Really, really pretty. Okay, Cathrin, we've got about 20 minutes. So you're going to cover annuals and then some tips at the end, and hopefully we'll have time for a few more questions. So I think someone asked about what they could plant now by seed. So maybe this will help them.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about annuals. We're just going to touch on these very briefly. But just to be sure everybody's on the same page, I already described annuals. The definition of that is the seed germinates, grows, flowers, sets seed, and then dies all in one season or in 1 year. So vegetables, most of the vegetables we grow, either they are annuals or we grow them as annuals because they're kind of done producing, so we chop them off and plant something else. Sunflowers, wheat, there are a lot of things that are annuals. Your bedding plants that you get from the garden center, a lot of those are sold as annuals, and you plant them as zinnias, that'll grow, then it dies down. If you're lucky, like in my yard, it will self-sow and it pops up in all kinds of strange places, which is, I think, fun. So perennials live for many years, usually, and they don't have a pre-programmed end to their life cycle. They'll keep living. Now, some are longer lived than others, but generally speaking, they're considered sort of permanent plants, and that's kind of why we've been focusing on that in this presentation, because those are the backbone of your garden. Those are the things that are there all the time. And annuals, I think of as kind of the icing on the cake. It's you have these and they come up and then they go away, but when they're up, they can be showstoppers. So they're beautiful. And biennials, you might run into that thing, that term, and that means that they grow the first year and get going, but then they don't flower and fruit until the second year. Okay, so sorry, thought I was on the next slide. So one of the cool things about annuals is that a lot of them work well in containers. So if you have a small yard or a yard without a lot of available soil or none, like you have a balcony, getting a good sized pot, where a good size is like at minimum of 18 inches across and deep, is good for most native annuals. You can sprinkle seeds in the pot, and this is the time of year to do it, really. Well, actually a little bit later, not during a heat wave, but we'll be getting rain soon, we hope, and it'll get cooler, and that's the best time to plant those seeds. So you can plant them in containers, and you can plant them as fill-in plants in your garden. So say, like in my front yard, right now it's all mulch, but as the soil improves under the sheet mulch, it's going to get good, and then I'll be ready to plant. And when I first plant, I'm going to be planting pots that are like 1 gallon size, about 6 inches across, 9 inches deep, or 4 inches even across. And it's going to look like, well, gee, is that all you're going to plant? But if I take away some of the mulch and spread annual seeds there in the spring, it's going to look fabulous, because I'll have all those flowers in the middle, and those little tiny plants will get going, and eventually they'll fill in. But in the meantime, I can have a show in my front yard. So in choosing annuals, you can go to Calscape, and it's got all the information about annuals. That's one of the filter criteria as well. But one good way to get started is using a pre-made wildflower mix, because those are selected by the seed company so that they all have the same requirements. Like it's a full sun mix or it's a shade mix. They will grow together. Usually there's kind of a succession of bloom that they plant. So they have some things that bloom early, like baby blue eyes maybe, and then late, like Clarkia. There's a picture of the blue flowers on the right are baby blue eyes. And of course, California poppies, most people know what those are. And those actually bloom for a very long period. We have some in the garden that have been blooming since the spring, and they're still blooming. They come and go in terms of how much bloom, but there's always some little sparkles of orange in the garden. But if you want to make your own, or just pick individual species, you can do that too. And again, Calscape is a great resource for picking what you want. You can see how tall it gets. Typical garden design, you want the taller things in the back and the shorter things in front. What kind of soil they like. And if you plant it in the fall, after the first soaking rain, that's usually the guidance. And usually that's a good time, because we then have periodic rain throughout the season. This is the ideal situation, right? And those seeds will get going because the soil is damp. Subsequent rains will keep them going, and they will start to grow, and you won't have to be putting any water that you pay for on them. Over winter, you think, well, it's awful cold out there for these plants, but that's what they expect. In fact, some seeds won't get going until they've had some of that cold, and then they will pop up, and you'll start to see sprouts, and they will grow. And most of our annual wildflowers start growing in early spring and keep going into like midsummer, and then most of them are kind of done by that time. Yeah, so that's all we're going to say about annuals for now. There's of course a lot more to talk about, but we're short on time, so let's get to a couple of some key tips. And one of the things that I think is a mistake is, well, I know it's slow growing, so I'm going to buy a really big plant and I'm going to put it in. That's chancy even for any kind of plant, but maybe for natives even more, because what you're doing is you take something, if it's in a big plant in a big pot, it's been in that pot for years, and that pot has different soil from what you're going to be growing it in, and the smaller it is, the younger it is, the more typically it is in its growth mode. So putting it in your soil, in your ground, when it's smaller, 4 inches, 6 inches, quote, gallon size, is a better, more likely to be successful. And actually, what some people have studied some of these things, and the 1 gallon pots will catch up to the 5 gallon pots in a couple of years very often. So, yeah, you need to be a little bit patient, but those plants will be healthier, they'll have better root systems, and you're more likely to be successful. We talked about good draining soil, planting in the fall after you've got some good soaking rain, because then the water has soaked down into the soil. So as those roots go down, they're going to be looking for water. They're going to grow toward the water. And if it's dry underneath, they're going to stop. So you need to have that deep watering. Grouping plants with similar needs. You don't want a stream-side orchid next to a desert plant, because the desert plant's either going to get way too much water or the orchid is not going to get enough. So group plants that have similar water needs, and that's going to really make your life a lot easier and the plants happier. And one thing, sometimes people, it's unfortunate, they think, oh, it's a native, so I shouldn't have to water it. I'll just plant it and walk away. Well, because it's drought tolerant, right? Well, how do things become drought tolerant? In a lot of cases, they do that by building really deep root systems. Those roots go down feet, yards, so 20 feet sometimes. And so it's not magic that you can have greenery in August in the hills in California. It's because there's groundwater underneath. But for the first few years, typically 1 to 2 years, but it depends on the plant, it's got to build that root system. And until it does, it's going to need extra water. So, you can't just stick it in the ground and walk away for the first year or two until it's established. And that's kind of more of an art than a science to determine if it's grown, put on a lot of new growth, and it's gotten, maybe double the size. That's kind of an indication. If you cut back on the water and it starts to suffer, then you say, well, maybe it needs more. But there is on our website, and we'll give some links here in a minute, I think, we have a California native gardening page. And in there, there's a section on watering. It has some resources you can go look up to give you some really specific kind of like guidance. What does it mean to say water deeply, for example, which is an important concept. And the other thing about native plants, one last thing is a lot of these plants really don't like being fertilized. So some people think, well, if it's slow growing, maybe if I put Miracle-Gro on it, it will grow faster. Well, that can actually kind of defeats the purpose, because what the native plants are doing is they're building a community underground that works with the soil microbes. And if you throw foreign, strange chemicals in the ground, it disrupts that community. And so it might put on a burst of growth, but then it could slow down or even suffer. So resist the urge to fertilize things unless you see, especially in pots, that's an exception, because it doesn't have that robust soil community. And you might need to use some, never very powerful, preferably organic soil fertilizer that can help things in pots, but things in the ground typically don't need anything. Okay, really quickly, because I want to have enough time for some questions. Maintenance. So ideally, especially if you're working with a landscape designer or architect, when you get your plants installed, they're going to give you a map that shows you what plants are where. And even more ideally, though I'm sorry to say, it doesn't always happen, you're going to get some guidance about what to do in each season for that plant. Like we talked about the ceanothus. Well, if you trim it in the winter, you're cutting off all the blooms and it'll be susceptible to disease. That's kind of the opposite from your roses, right? When do you prune roses? January. Well, not ceanothus. So ideally, you would be getting a plan that tells you what to do when, at least by season. If you don't, Calscape also, and there are lots of books also that talk about month by month guide in the garden. What do you need to do? Deadheading, just like any other plants, you can cut off the old flowers and often more will come. Pinching things to keep them to keep them bushy and keep them from overgrowing. One of the books I read, just pretend you're a deer, or if you have deer, maybe they'll do this for you. But you could do light pruning, like trimming the ends to kind of bring it back if there's sort of long, spindly things going on. Anything dead, damaged, diseased, of course, that can go. But again, timing, it does matter. So it's something to learn about that isn't necessarily the same as, for instance, your roses. And then the slides talk about rainy season and disease concerns. Leaf litter. Now, under roses, you're supposed to clear out under the roses completely every season, right? Or depending on how rigorous you are, but frequently, certainly every season, because it harbors diseases. But under natives, that leaf litter acts as mulch, and it's the most natural mulch there is, because in the wild, there's nobody raking underneath your sage bushes. It just drops its leaves, and those leaves go down there and they decompose, and they make the best mulch there is for those plants. So leaving a lot of that is really a good idea. It's also where a lot of those butterflies and moths, they're overwintering they're pupating in that leaf litter. If you clean out the leaf litter, you've just tossed away all that hard work and all those animals that would emerge in the spring. Okay. We're going to have to go really fast here. Native plant gardens. Here's a list. We mentioned our demonstration garden that Carol and I are involved in. There's a bunch. You can actually go on Google Maps and search for native garden, and you'll see a bunch come up, including this one and others. So we'll go to the next slide. And then garden tours. These are fantastic. They're free. They're in the spring when a lot of native gardens are like at their peak, most showy. And there's one set called Bringing Back the Natives that's in the East Bay. And then Santa Clara Valley chapter has one that includes Santa Clara and San Mateo County. And they're both in April. Now, native plant nurseries. So some native plants are hard to find. Others are readily available. In fact, if you become knowledgeable about native plants and you look around the ordinary plant section nursery, you might spot some natives in there, like the manzanitas. Sea thrift is a native, right? And it's just there with the other non-natives because it's been in the trade for a long time and it's widely used. But here are a few of the native nurseries. The list, the link that's there, that's the CNPS list of nurseries, has a lot more. And Calscape will give you pointers as well, both to nurseries that have, brick and mortar nurseries as well as online sources. Okay. More resources, websites. Okay. We don't have time to go through all this list here. And then books. So there are a lot of books, and these are 3 favorites, especially the first 2. And the Month by Month Guide by Helen Popper, that is written by someone who's in Santa Clara Valley. So they're very close she's very close. And so a lot of her recommendations are very in tune with this San Mateo County as well. Okay. And our last slide is the general. If you have questions, and I know we won't have time to answer all the questions, you can ask a master gardener any gardening question you have about natives or anything else. There's in person and there's online, and you could go online and submit pictures of your plants. And we also have in-person plant clinics. And that's enough of that. And then acknowledgements. Thank you, Ling So, for hosting these talks, and this one in particular, and Can for getting us set up and everything and helping us through the process. And now we have time for questions. A little. Sorry.
Alrighty, so we've got 5 minutes, but there's quite a lot of questions here, so we'll try to get to them as quickly as possible here. Okay, so this person is planning on planting native plants in their home orchard where they have 23 fruit trees. The plants are native to where they live. And they're wondering whether they should avoid planting the natives within the drip lines of the fruit trees, since the fruit trees need to be fertilized several times per year.
You want to take that one, Cathrin, or?
Well, so I don't have experience with an orchard myself and growing natives under it. So I don't know. Carolyn, do you have any?
Well, yeah, I guess a couple thoughts. I mean, we talk about most of these natives don't want fertilizer. So they're listening to our presentation, they're asking the question. And so my first thought is probably not a good idea. But if there's an opportunity to grow some natives outside of, the drip line and where the fertilizer is, I have I have an apple tree. I don't have an orchard, but I have one apple tree. And so I have natives that bloom the same time my apple blooms, so I can help bring in the pollinators. So if there's an opportunity to have some of these shrubs, especially the ones that bloom at the same time your fruit is blooming, but they're going to have a different requirement of what they need than the fruit trees. So you don't really want them sharing that same space, I would not think. So that's
a lot of sources recommend, like creating a hedgerow or an area adjacent to the vegetable garden, like Carolyn showed in her slide, right, that had the natives next to where the vegetable garden is. So nearby, but not in the exact same space. So they have different water requirements. The fertilizer is a valid, it's a real concern. So
it's great to put them, it's great to have natives with fruit trees, but just, they can't be in the same zone, I would not think. So, yeah.
I will take the time to kind of put in a little plug for next month's class on cover crops. However, I think those are a fantastic idea. Next month's Master Gardeners class, attend that. It's all about cover crops. Maybe there lies your solution there. So check that out. Okay, so next question. What are your thoughts about leaving a few non-native plants around the orchard that attracts a lot of bumblebees and other pollinators?
I feel, well, if you like the plants, like you really like them, like I like my camellias, so, I'm going to keep them. But, what's the reason that they're there? Is because you like them, then keep them. They're doing well there. But if you're trying to support wildlife, those plants that may have bumblebees coming to them probably don't support as much wildlife as a native plant would. And I think, the bumblebees almost all the bumblebees are native. There's only a few species, I think, in the United States that are not native. So you see a bumblebee, presume it's native. They evolved with the native plants. They didn't evolve with the non-native plants. They will go feed on them, but I just, and we're supposed to be science-based research, and there may be some science on this, but I just think anecdotally, it just makes more sense to me that the plants that evolved with the bumblebees are probably the best plants to support the bumblebees and the bumblebee health. But if you're in love with that plant, and we're in love with a lot of our plants and it's doing well, that's okay too. I think a mix, you don't have to go all native. But I think in general, the native plants are probably the better sources for supporting the wildlife than the exotics.
Alrighty, thank you for that. We've got several questions about the blooming charts that you had mentioned for the San Carlos garden. Do we have access to those charts and colors and bloom seasons and such?
Since I started volunteering at the demonstration garden, I took over the data analysis part of that, and I just really got those charts to there's a ton of data, so it took some doing, but I'm going to be posting those on our website associated with the demonstration garden, and so those will be available from the Master Gardener website. They're not there right now.
Maybe in one of our newsletters, our public newsletters, when they are up on the website, we can put it in the newsletter. Yeah. And so if you subscribe to our monthly newsletter, you'll get an update when they are available.
All righty, thank you. Could you both discuss a bit about natives, growing natives in pots, containers?
Yes, it's a great thing to do. So my backyard is mostly concrete, but I love natives, so I've got natives growing in pots. And like I said, annuals, I've had great luck growing annuals in good sized pots. You're not going to put it in a 6-inch pot. Most natives won't do well in that. There are exceptions. I'll name a couple, but if you want something that is like annual or a perennial, it's going to need a little bit more soil, a little more room. And so you can grow them in pots. And like I said, annuals, you can look for perennials that have, for instance, relatively shallow roots. I talked about deep roots. Well, there are some that are shallow rooted. And in fact, in Calscape, often it will mention if something is good for containers. There is another Master Gardener project, which is also in San Carlos. It's the Laurel Street Container Garden. They have 25 large concrete pots up and down Laurel Street. This is San Carlos Main Street. And it's not exclusively native, but there are a lot of natives in there, including one pot that is consistently a showstopper. And it's got yarrow in there, different varieties, but it is just gorgeous. There are other natives in other pots. You can see an example at that garden, which you can find on Google Maps as well, and see some kinds of things that could be done there. So I've answered the question.
Yeah, I've grown a few. One I love growing is the California poppy, the native variety, the orange one, but they also come in white, and that's kind of a white creamy one, and I just love it. And I put it in a container because it's all contained, and then I can actually move it. It's a fairly small, like maybe a 10-inch pot. I can actually move it around. It's like a bouquet, and I just love it. And then I can kind of keep track of how it's doing, because when it's time to collect the seeds, I'm right on it, because I like to grow more and share it. So I also had some sages in pots, and they can get kind of big, in the pot. So I try to keep them trimmed down. And then every few years, I'm just going to have to take them out of the pot and either, maybe up pot them or something. So you can do a lot with pots. It's really, it makes it really versatile for the kind of the plants we talked about. I mean, I wouldn't grow a tree in a pot per se, but all these smaller shrubs and ground covers shouldn't be any trouble whatsoever.
I was going to mention two plants that I think do well in even a small pot. One is some of the native succulents called Dudleyias. Coast live forever. They've got a lot of common names, but they are little rosette type succulents, right? And succulents typically do well in pots so long as you have a good draining mix. And the other one is it doesn't look like a succulent, but it's called cliff maids or Lewisia. It has amazing flowers. It blooms over and over again, but it requires super, super great drainage. And in my yard, the best way to give it that seems to be put it in a pot with some like cactus mix. So those two seem to do fine in pots for a very long time.
I want to be respectful of people's time. So those who have to leave, totally fine. You're welcome to leave, but this class is being recorded. So we'll stay on to answer a few more questions if you both don't mind. And we do have several other questions to get to. So I think those are pretty fun questions. So if you don't mind, would you mind staying a few more minutes to answer questions? Is that okay?
It's fine.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Alrighty. Let's go back up here. Okay, so this person, they live in the Redwood Valley in Mendocino County. They have poison ivy and oak. Well, I think poison ivy and oak seems to be everywhere. What do they do about it? Is it native? They live on the Russian River, and they want to be careful not to pollute the water.
Well, so what they have is poison oak. And poison ivy, I think, is on the east of the Rockies. So we have its cousin, the poison oak, and it can be a shrub, almost a small tree. It can be a vine. It's very very good at surviving all sorts of habitats, and it can be a real problem. I remember early on when I was doing some work on the helpline, somebody had cleared a bunch of area, and it was a bunch of poison oak, and he didn't know it, and he got a really bad case of a rash and a problem with it, because he was trying to clear some like 5 acres, and within that 5 acres to try and get rid of the poison oak. So it's a native plant, so it's not going to poison everything around it. It's not going to poison the river or anything like that. It has an irritant in it that that irritates our skin. And if somebody were collecting twigs or starting a fire and they had poison oak in it and it burned, you could get it in your lungs and get it systemically, and it could be really dangerous. People could have a severe reaction to it. So it's not harmful at all in the environment. The native bees, they love poison oak. Some of the animals, they eat it. It's really just, as far as I know, just the humans that have an irritation with it. So if you want to remove it or cut it back, you really need to be, Cathrin, you've got those long arm protection thing. You need
Yes.
gloves. You need to be fully covered, like you're out, like a beekeeper sometimes get, because you just don't want it to get in contact with your skin. And so it's a kind of hard plant to get out, though, I will tell you that. And it does drop its leaves. So in the wintertime, it just looks like twigs, and you can still get an allergic reaction to it, even when there's no leaves on it. So it's not at all harmful to the environment. If you want to remove it, it can be done, but you have to do it with a lot of care, or hire someone to do it and let them make sure that they know it's poison oak, and it's really all the safety precautions are taken.
Right, and just to add to that, I think that you would be talking about removing it by like using a brush cutter, kind of a device, right, to cut it down to the ground. Try to pull it, but it will grow back from underground roots. And so I've heard of people who've done sheet mulching, right, putting a heavy layer of cardboard and then mulch on after you cut it down, heavy layer of cardboard and mulch, and then basically digging out or uprooting or cutting off anything that pokes through. But it's a long-term project. It's not something that's going to be quick to get rid of. But if you just, you might want to do sections, start with a small area and work your way out. But yeah, it's a very tough and adaptable plant, unfortunately for us.
Dan, did you see my comment on that?
Yes, I was just going to read that out. Peggy had said rent goats.
Yeah, they'll eat it.
Yeah, so that's a great, and it's to service a lot of local shepherd folks. They rent out their goats, and we see it along the freeways here all the time. So it's a great suggestion. Thank you. Okay, so I'm not really sure which slide this question is referring to, but I'm assuming it's the chart that you had put out, and they are wondering what plant on the bottom of the slide that blooms most of the year. I think there are a couple of them.
Well, so I'll be posting the actual charts with the data from the demonstration garden. There are a few that just astonish me, like the island pink yarrow, that beautiful bright pink one, which is a native. It's not a hybrid. It's from the islands, the Channel Islands in California, and it has blooms on it every month of the year. I just, I wouldn't have believed it, except I took the data and other responsible people took the data. And there are a few others that, have blooms. Now, one caution about that, and one of the things I want to do when I, put out this chart for public consumption is, whether something's blooming right now depends on a lot of things. Did you deadhead it? Well, did you cut off all the flowers? Did you prune it back? And, after that, if you prune it harder, it's going to take a while before it can grow back out and bloom again. So when something actually has flowers on it will depend on that. It'll depend on the weather. The demo garden was on the Growing Natives Garden Tour this year. And we were really, kind of biting our fingernails, because normally at that date, we'd have a lot of things blooming, but I counted 20 plants that were not blooming that normally would have been, because the spring was so cold and damp. Damp was good for us, but cold delayed everything. And so I could tell by our data that these 20 plants should have been blooming. So we made little signs and stuck them out with pictures of the plants. Another feature of Calscape.
Yeah, while you were talking, I did pull up that list, and I think at the bottom it had hummingbird sage. That was on the bottom, and the very top for the white ones, it was the yarrow. But the hummingbird sage, I think 11 months out of 12. But it's it's a really big flower head, but it's not really profuse at all. And that data is and we may enhance it more, but that data is if we saw something blooming. So if it's one plant, one flower, that flower head, that was it. So because I can just tell you, hummingbird sage, it can bloom almost year round, but it's never lush in bloom.
It's not always in full bloom, right? This is yeah. So you need to take that as a starting point, but not as the final word on things.
Alrighty. This person, they live in Berkeley and they have 3 oak trees in a very small backyard, and they're wondering what grows well under oak trees. Are there edible plants that might grow well under it?
Well, yeah, a lot of people want to grow under oak trees. So I guess the caveat is if it's presuming it's the native oaks that are from this area, because there are oaks from the Mediterranean as well. But if it's our native oaks, and even in Mediterranean oaks, I guess none of them are used to having summer rains. So you don't want to, whatever you plant, it's got to be compatible, with what the oak needs. Because if you put really pretty showy flowers that need to be watered a lot, then the oak is getting water in the summer when it really doesn't want it, and that can cause long-term damage to the oak and shorten its lifespan substantially. So with that caveat, a lot of people, they want to put things underneath the oaks. There are some native plants. Some of the books that we referred to have some lists, but bunch grasses, plants that have similar habit and don't need water in the summer. So established bunch grasses. I don't know, maybe the woodland strawberry would be okay. There's not a heck of a lot, if you walk in the woods, go look at those oak woodlands, and it's just mostly leaf litter. You don't see a lot underneath there, and what you do see is going to be pretty sparse. Regarding something that you can eat and that's edible, I can't think of any California natives. I just can't think of any. A lot of our food that we want to eat, it needs water. You put more water into it, and
it grows in the summer.
Yeah, and again, the oaks, you really don't want to put things that are going to require water. So you might, again, for more information, you could contact our helpline, or the helpline actually in Alameda County, where Berkeley is, and just ask them. And going on these garden tours, can't really emphasize it enough, but you can come see our garden anytime you want. It's a public garden in a public space, no gates. It's open all the time, 24 hours a day. But the garden tour is a lot of homeowners that are opening up their gardens that one day or one weekend a year, where you can go to visit their garden and talk to them about what's going on. And if you're interested in what can you put under oaks, each garden will have a list of what plants they have. And I always like to see, well, the mature gardens, a garden that was put in 2 years ago, anybody can, that's great. But, I want to see what's it going to look like 5 years, 10 years, whatever. So check out the garden tour in the East Bay next year and find the folks that have oak trees. And if they're, a mature garden, go out there and see what they're doing. That's another way to do your research on that.
Alrighty, thank you. Would it be advisable to plant natives between roses?
Well, the right natives, sure. We talked about some natives are very adaptable and appreciate summer water, right? So one of my favorites is Sea Thrift. It's actually sold in the regular garden centers, right? It's not it, but it happens to be a native. It's got little pink pom-poms on it, and the rest of the year it's got evergreen grassy foliage and small mounds. I'm actually planning to put it around my roses that I'm keeping in the front yard when I plant the rest as natives, right? It's a coastal plant, and it appreciates fog drip and so on. So a little extra water because the roses are there, it'll be fine. So just look for plants that are compatible. Again, we talked about grouping compatible plants together, and wherever they came from, if they want a certain amount of water, kite type of soil, just match that, and you can find natives that will grow very well along with roses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see in the comments, somebody said they plant lavender around their roses to keep deer away. So that's not a native, but they look nice together. I have to say aesthetically, and I really don't have any strength in design per se, but I do struggle and think about the roses, people that have rose gardens. Gee, they should, introduce some natives into their garden. And I really scratch my head trying to think what would really fit in and look nice, and I have to say I struggle with that. But there are wonderful native plant design books, top, real professional landscape architects and landscape designers that might have, a lot of times it's a whole 100% native garden. But I think that is a challenge. Some exotic plants that we just love. If you want to start growing natives with them, which ones would you grow and how would you still keep it a really nice design? And I think it's a little tricky, frankly, with roses. They go through such dramatic changes. They're dead, looking bare root, bare stems over winter, and then that lush green growth and the huge fast growth and all the flowers. And then it goes away again. And what would you put in there as a native? I don't, it's a tough one, but certainly all the characteristics that roses need, make sure that the natives would be in the same characteristic. Look at the list and then let's see, start going through the list, and there might be something there that might work for you.
Alrighty, I'm gonna do one more questions because I know we're running almost 20 minutes over. What kind of soil do you recommend for potted plants or potting plants, I guess?
Well, I guess I'll take that one. I think the key is that it's well draining, and I like to use cactus and succulent mix for growing natives in pots because it has more grit in it. Typically has, you'll see more little pebbles and it's sandier. Also, I prefer an organic mix. So one that does not have chemical fertilizers in it, again, because it's going to feed the microbes, not directly feed the plant. And it'll be gentler on the roots. Sometimes you might hear about if you over fertilize, things would get burned. And that means that the roots have been damaged because of the chemical fertilizers been too strong. And natives tend to be a little bit more sensitive. So they grow fine without adding any or just a very mild organic fertilizer. But the key thing is it's well draining and that your pot has really good drainage. I have made the mistake of thinking, well, my pot had holes. Well, the holes got plugged up and then it rained and I saw, inches of water sitting on the top of the pot and like, oops, that's not draining anymore. So you need to, keep an eye on it, make sure that the drainage is continuing to work. But you can use a regular potting mix and mix something in to lighten it up, like mixing in perlite, for example, which is readily available in garden centers. Or you can buy pre-made, native plant mix, which has more grit and more drainage.
Yeah, and I was going to add, I believe, Lingzo, there's a couple of mixes there. Well, it kind of depends what you're growing. If you're growing something that's like a shady plant that's more of a woodland plant, then it probably wants something more acidic, and the rhododendron mix might be the appropriate soil mix for that. I think you also have what else do you have? Anything with sometimes the soils have fertilizers in them, and you definitely want to avoid those. Even just simple sandy loam, and then which is just an inorganic material, and then add some like leaf litter or a little bit of compost that came from plants would, I think, be suitable. You have a landscape mix, so I think that might be pretty good. But if you're growing it in containers, because of the drainage issue, you might need to add some perlite or something to the landscape mix. So, that's sort of what I'd go toward. I agree with you about the desert, the cactus and succulent mix. It's just a nice, I kind of, when I first opened it, I kind of was expecting, it's just going to be sandy, but it's like, it's brown, so it has organic material in it, broken down plant material, but then it just has that excellent drainage. So that's a good general purpose one. And, if it's a shady or loving plant, then you might want to have a little bit more organic material in it, I would think. So, yeah. Okay.
Alrighty, fantastic. I know we didn't get to all the questions today, but you can always, actually, if you don't mind, could you put up the last Master Gardener slide where they can email in or call the text helpline perhaps?
Okay.
While you're doing that, I just want to thank everybody for attending and for all those amazing questions. And Cathrin, as well as Carolyn, you guys did a fantastic job. Thank you for the plethora of resources and the data. And the slide will be, actually the recording will be available under Linkso's community resources page, as well as the Master Gardeners page. And if you folks have any questions, you can email the Master Gardeners here in this slide.
Here we go. Sorry about that.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Didn't expect to go backwards here. But yeah, there's our information. It's also on our website. You can find it, and it'll say ask a Master Gardener on the website, and click on it. And as Cathrin mentioned, the more information you give us in your question will help us do the research. So photos, is it growing in sun or shade? Is it in the container or in the ground? How old is the plant? Has it been fertilized? For anything that you submit to us, the more data that we get, the better. Because sometimes if a key piece of information is missing, we may have to send you a note saying, hey, yeah, is this getting irrigated or not? So the more, just give us a lot of information, and then we can probably research it pretty quickly and get right back to you.
Alrighty, well, thank you so very much. And this was a fantastic talk. And if they have questions, they'll contact you. So don't be surprised if you get questions a few months down the line about your talk.
That's fine. We're looking forward to it. Okay, thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.